Welcome to Shahnameh, Book of Kings. Today we continue with the Reign of Ardeshir. Ardeshir was not pleased when he heard that Haftvad, and he sent commanders against him with a fine body of men ready for battle. But Haftvad was not at all alarmed. He set up an ambush in a defile of the mountains, and then went against the approaching army at the head of his troops. When the two armies had joined battle and were laying about one another with maces and battle axes, the hidden soldiers burst out from the ambush, and the earth became a dark place for the invaders. They were so hemmed in that no one knew his hand from his feet, and so many were killed that the victors were stupefied by the numbers of dead. Anyone from Ardeshir's forces who remained alive quickly fled back to the king. Ardeshir was angered when he heard about the way his troops had been killed and their baggage plundered. He quickly mustered an army to when he distributed arms and cash and set out against Haftvad. Immediately, while this commoner was still exulting in his triumph, Haftvad brought treasure and weapons from his fortress and was not at all troubled by Ardeshir's approach. His eldest son was living far away, but when he heard of his father's battles, he gave up his life of lazing and feasting and took a ship to return. This ambitious youth was called Shahnameh, and he was an ill-made, ill-spoken man. When he disembarked, Haftwad's heart rejoiced to see his son, and he put him in charge of the right wing of the army, while he himself remained the overall commander. Now, face to face, the two armies were both well equipped, eager for war, and backed up by considerable wealth. King Ardeshir looked at them, and his young heart grew old and with anxiety. The columns faced one another, and the sun glinted on their swords. Then the din of drums resounded from the elephants' backs, and men 2 miles away quailed at the noise. The blaring of trumpets began, and the squeal of brazen bugles. The earth quaked beneath the horses' hoofs. The air was crimson, and chieftains' banners were so great with the racket of maces against helmets that the sky seemed to bid the earth farewell. Galloping horses tore up the earth. The plain was filled with trunkless heads, and Haftwad's army fought with such fury they seemed like a lake whipped up by the wind. So thick was the press of men on each side that not an ant or a mosquito could have been found room there anywhere. So the battle went on until the day paled into evening, and then night spread its purple cloak. Ardeshir summoned his scattered soldiers and made camp beside a brackish lake. When the rust-colored waters turned black, each army sent out its scouts and guards. The king's army was badly fed that night because their malevolent enemy had cut off the road by which they had been supplied. In Jerome, there was a low-born man named Merrick, the son of Nushzid. When he heard that Ardeshir had left the area and was camped by a lake after a hard-fought battle, and that the army's supply route had been interrupted, he set off for the king's palace with a large group of followers. He looted its treasures and distributed crowns and cash to his men. Ardeshir received news of this at the lakeside and grew pensive, saying to himself, "Why am I fighting against strangers when I haven't secured my own palace?" He summoned the chieftains and told them at length what Merrick had said. He says, "You are my army commanders. What do you think we should do in this desperate situation? Fate has sent us sorrows enough, and we overlooked Merrick and his potential for trouble." They answered, "Your Majesty, may your eyes never see ill fortune. Since Merrick has revealed himself as your covert enemy, why should you endure these hardships to conquer the world? But you have greatness, and the earth is yours. We are your slaves, and you are our master." Ardeshir ordered that a meal be prepared and asked for wine and entertainers. A few spitted lambs were placed before the men, and they began to eat. Ardeshir had a piece of bread in his hand when an arrow plunged right into the lamb carcass in front of him. Alarmed, the chieftains drew back from the food, while one of them took the arrow out of the meat. There was writing on it, and an officer who was also a scribe read it aloud. The inscription was in Pahlavi, and it said, "Listen, wise king, this arrow's from the fort, where peace reigns and the mighty worm holds court. If I had aimed the shaft at Ardeshir, it would have passed right through you. It is clear. No king like you can hope for victory against the worm's all-powerful sovereignty." It was the two parasangs from the forest to their camp, and when the inscription was read, the chieftains' hearts were horrified. All of them invoked God's blessings on their king and his glory. Ardeshir brooded on these events all night long, and when the sun rose the next morning, he struck camp and led the army back from the lake towards Pars. They marched quickly, but the enemy forces harassed them from behind, raiding the columns constantly and killing many of their leaders. The cry pursued them, "The worm's good fortune shines, and he alone illuminates the splendor of the throne." The soldiers said one to another, "This is a wonder which everyone should marvel at." They rode on against uneven ground, their hearts filled with anxiety, until they saw a large city that bore down on it with the speed of wolves. Nearby, they saw several men standing in front of a house. The king and his men waited for a moment, and the strangers questioned them, asking how they came to be there so unexpectedly. Man, we're having troubles with this today. The soldiers said one to another, "This is a wonder which everyone should marvel at." They rode on across uneven ground, their hearts filled with anxiety, until they saw a large city, and they bore down on it with the speed of wolves. Nearby, they saw two young men standing in front of a house. The king and his men paused for a moment. The strangers questioned them, asking how they came to be there so unexpectedly and where they had arrived from, covered in the dust of the road. And the king said, "Ardeshir fled this way, and we were left behind in his flight. He's running from the worm and from Haftvad and from the rabble of an army." The two young men started forward, filled with concern on the fugitives' behalf. They had them dismount, walking them in, making them a place to rest and sleep. The two sat with the king at his meal and entertained him well, saying, "My lord, neither sorrow nor joy last for long. Look at the unjust Sahak, and all he took from the royal throne, and all the malevolent Alforzab who tormented the Persian kings, and at Seconder, who in recent times killed the world's kings. They have all departed, and all that remain of them is an evil name, and they will not taste the joys of paradise. This Haftvad, who will end the same way, he too will at last writhe in his own death agony." At their words, the king's heart opened like a flower in springtime. He was so comforted by their remarks that he decided to tell them the truth, and he said, "I am Ardeshir, the son of Sasan, and I need your advice. How can I fight against this accursed worm and against Haftvad?" The two young men bowed before him, and both said, "May you always thrive, and may the reach of evil be far from you. Our bodies and souls are your slaves. May your spirit endure forever. As for the worm, some kind of stratagem must be employed against it. You won't be able to defeat it unless you resort to underhanded tactics. The worm and his treasure and followers are ensconced on that mountain top, with a city on one side and the lake on the other, and the way up to their fastness is a difficult one. In his essence, the worm is Ahriman, the enemy of the creator of the world. You say he's a worm, but inside that leathery skin, he's a devil thirsty for blood." Ardeshir felt reassured by their kind words and said, "All that is true, and I leave it to you to come up with something against him." They answered, "We are your slaves, and will always recommend what is right to you." Cheered by their talk, the king went forward once more, assured of victory, taking the two young men with him. And so they proceeded with clear conscience and confidence to Curai Ardeshir. There was a courtier assembled about him. He rested from war. He reprovisioned his army, and then turned to the problem of Merrick, the son of Nushzad. Merrick was terrified to learn of his approach, and as Ardeshir drew near Jerem, the traitor hid from him. But the king was determined to hunt him down, and when Merrick was taken prisoner, Ardeshir cut off his head with an Indian sword and had his headless trunk burned. Then he stabbed to death every member of Merrick's family who fell into his hands apart from one of his daughters, who managed to keep herself hidden, even though she was sought for throughout the whole town. His next concern was to make war on the worm, and he mustered an army for this purpose. Assembling 12,000 experienced cavalry, he reunited his scattered troops. He brought his reconstituted forces to an area between two mountains. He appointed a shrewd man named Shaji as his commander and said to him, "Stay here and be on your guard. Send scouts out day and night and let them be good, capable horsemen. Likewise, have sentries and watchmen posted to safeguard the army. Meanwhile, I'm going to resort to a trick. Esfandiar is an ancestor of mine, after all. If the watchman sees smoke rise up in the daytime and then fire at night as bright as the day, you're to understand that the worm's power is at an end, that I've turned his luck and rid the world of him." He chose 7 of his best warriors, all brave as lions, and men who could be trusted. Not a word was said to anyone else as to what was afoot. He picked out a large number of jewels from his treasury, as well as brocade, gold coins, and other kinds of wealth, his wise eyes carefully selecting the best items. Then he filled 2 chests with lead and included a brass cauldron, an item that would be crucial for the success of his venture. He wrapped everything in cloth, procured 10 large donkeys from the head of his stables, loaded up his goods, and covered them over with coarse kilims. Impatient to put into work his plan of action, the little group set off for the worm's fastness. The 2 young men who had entertained Ardeshir during his flight went with them. They had become friends with Ardeshir, and he valued their advice. The caravan was disguised to look like a merchant's. When they could see the castle and its city in the distance, a lookout called to them. "What have you got in those chests?" The king shouted back. "All sorts of things for sale, cloths and clothes and gold and silver, gold, coins, brocade, pearls, and jewels. We're merchants from Kosseron, traveling, never resting. I've accumulated a large, fine amount of goods, thanks to the worm's good fortune, so now I've come to pay my respects before his throne. It's his luck that has helped me, and if it is allowable, I will offer my homage to him." The worm's servant opened the gates to the castle, and the caravan went inside. Ardeshir quickly opened up his packages and handed over things worthy of the man's station. He set out a stall before the servants, opened the chests, and filled a goblet with wine. Those whose turn it was to feed the worm with milk and rice turned away from the wine, not wanting to get drunk at this time. Realizing this, Ardeshir stood up and said, "I have a huge amount of rice and milk, and if his keepers will allow it should please me to feed the worm for 3 days. This will give me a name in the world, and the worm's lucky star might look kindly on me. Drink wine with me for 3 days, and on the 4th, when the sun rises to illuminate the world, I'll make a fine shop here, even higher than your palace, and I'll apply my trade of buying and selling, and in this way I'll increase my honor in the worm's eyes." With these words he got his wish. The keepers responded, "You can serve the wine." The donkey driver placed everything at their service and began to serve the wine. Gradually they became drunk. Those whom the worm had commanded were now commanded by wine. As soon as their tongues were fuddled, the king and the 2 young men brought out the cauldron and lead and made a fire. When it was time for the worm to be fed, its food was boiling lead. They saw its vermilion tongue waiting to lap up the rice as it usually did. The young men poured the lead down its throat, and when its bowels split, its strength oozed away. A loud crack came from its throat, and the cistern where it lived, and the whole town round about, shook with the force of it. Ardeshir and the 2 young men attacked like the wind. They snatched up their maces, their swords, and their bows, and not one of the drunken servitors escaped from them alive. From the roof of the castle, they sent up columns of smoke as a signal to the army commander. Seeing it, the watchman ran to Shahnameh and saying, "King Ardeshir is victorious!" Immediately, he led his army forward to join their king. When Haftvad heard what had happened, he was frightened and confused. He hurried to the castle to retake it, but the king was already on its rampart. All his efforts were useless. A lion stood on the city's wall. Shahnameh brought up the army like a mighty mountain, but his men hesitated and hung back. Ardeshir shouted down at them, "Come forward and fight!" Shahnameh, "If Haftvad escapes us, for all your efforts, you'll have nothing in your fist but air. I fed the worm hot lead. His power is gone. His anger has melted away." When they heard the king's words, the Persian troops took heart, put on their metal helmets, and prepared for battle. The wind of war turned against the worm's forces. Haftvad was captured, and so was Shahnameh, his eldest son, and the commander of his troops. King Ardeshir came down from the battlements, and Shahnameh came forward to greet him on foot. He brought a horse carapace in gold, on which the triumphant king sat. He gave orders that the 2 gibbets were to be set up on the lake shore, where the 2 malefactors were strung up alive. The sight of them broke the hearts of Ardeshir's enemies. Then Shahnameh stepped forward from the ranks of soldiers, and Haftvad and his son were killed in a rain of arrows. Ardeshir gave the town over to plunder, and the troops enriched themselves. Servants brought out whatever was valuable, and the fortress took everything in and was sent to Ardeshir. A fire temple was built in the province, and the festivals of Maragon and Sada were celebrated there. The land was handed over to the 2 young men who had been Ardeshir's host when he fled from the area. Ardeshir returned in triumph to Pars, and when the populace and flocks were settled again, he led his army to Ardeshir. He sent an army to Kenman to keep order in the area under a man who was worthy to rule. And now that his enemies had been defeated, he took up residence in Ctesiphon. And here is where I end my tale for today. But I'll be back tomorrow with more tales, many more tales. Until then, my friends,